Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is the 1st of May, 2019, and Chris and I are celebrating my 2-year anniversary here at the Independent Contractors and Businesses Association.
Yeah, we are?
Yes, today is 2 years.
2 years.
2 years ago today.
Yes.
Chris went down to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, picked me up like a puppy at the pound, and brought me home. And here I am 2 years later. Who would have thought we would have made it this far?
It's gone by very fast.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. That was not really complicated. Anyways, ICBA, we are I would say we are BC's #1 construction association. Certainly we are the North American Trade Association of the Year, according to the REIT Awards. And we stand up for the men and women in construction. 250,000 men and women got up today, went to work in construction. We are proud to represent them. Past couple days, Chris, by the way, is the president of ICBA. I am a VP Communications. Chris, yesterday was the day we've been dreading since the NDP seized power in 2017, the day they came down with their labor code changes. The top line was okay for us. We survived kind of the biggest battle of all, but certainly a lot of construction unfriendly things underneath it.
Yeah, we definitely missed the bullet in terms of the NDP government taking the secret ballot out of the labor code. Mm-hmm. And that's significant because what it means right now, and the status quo is going to remain the same on that issue, is that if workers sign enough union cards to indicate that they want to consider joining a union, there would be a secret ballot vote of all the employees at that site or in the company to determine whether or not the workers really do want to join a union. And the point of the secret ballot is it ensures that there's no intimidation.
There's no whipping the votes.
Yeah, by either the employer or union organizers. And so there are lots of examples of there's bad actors on both sides. Mm-hmm. So the secret ballot is the best protection against one side or the other exerting undue influence. So we're very glad that it stayed. But troubling remark by Minister Baines at the press conference was, he said if the NDP had a majority government, they would have stripped the secret ballot out of the labor code. Mm-hmm. Fundamentally unfair to workers. It tilts the playing field, not for workers, but for big labor.
Yes. Yeah, it's a big lot. Big Labor came out yesterday and applauded many of the changes made by Minister Baines, but certainly was very pointed in their criticism of not scrapping the secret ballot. The reason they want the secret ballot is pretty simple. The Manning Institute's done a lot of research on this. The chances that you become a union at the end of the process when you don't have a secret ballot are higher. If it's card check, you can kind of lean on guys, you can lean on co-workers. You can make it very uncomfortable for them if they don't sign their union cards. That is a higher percentage. Whereas the anonymous vote, of course, you can't whip it. You can't, tell who voted what. There's that protection. So we are very pleased, and we should cite him, Dr. Andrew Weaver, the BC Green Party. From the very beginning of this coalition government, Weaver came out and said that his party would not support scrapping the secret ballot. That would be a step too far in the labor code. We've been critical of Andrew Weaver on many issues. His opposition to Site C, his opposition to LNG, his opposition to Kinder Morgan, Trans Mountain Pipeline, and many other things. His blind hatred of the BC Liberals. But on this, look, give the devil his due. He was bang on. He stuck to his word. And Dr. Weaver really saved the secret ballot for workers in BC.
Yeah, if it wasn't for Andrew Weaver and his two Green MLAs, his two colleagues from the Green Party, the secret ballot would have been stripped out of the labor code. Yeah. So he does deserve a lot of credit on that issue, because I think it goes to fairness about how you go through, and when employees go through a process to make this decision. It's an important decision, and they should be able to make that decision and express their opinion without undue influence from employers or union organizers. Mm-hmm. And he stayed committed to that principle. It's something that he articulated over the last 2 years frequently. So he deserves a lot of credit for staying, because there would have been a lot of pressure exerted on him by Big Labor, and the fact that he held his ground, I think, says a lot, and it's good for construction workers in this province.
Absolutely, it's good for every worker in this province. Yeah. Okay, all that to say, there were many other changes in the labor code. Chris, I'm going to run through them one by one, and maybe we can kind of talk about them. First of all, the legislation does shorten the communication period before that secret ballot vote. Currently under the Act, it's 10 days, just 10 days. So from the time that, these workers, 40% of the workers have signed a card saying we want to vote on joining a union, there are 10 days in which the Labor Standards Board comes in and kind of keeps an eye on everything, much like Elections BC acts as a neutral arbiter in provincial elections. You have this group that comes in and it handles that. There's certain things that employers can and can't do, the unions can and can't do, and at the end of 10 days they have a vote. That 10-day period's now been shrunk to 5 working days. That is it may seem like a subtle shift, but it is a significant, frankly, it's something the unions wanted. So that can kind of tell you exactly who it favors.
Yeah, it's if you're a company owner or you're in senior management and you get a call saying from the labor board saying enough workers have signed union cards to trigger a secret ballot vote. Well, you have to prepare. You have to prepare employee lists. And this is the sensitivity here is what can employers say to their employees. Mm-hmm. And obviously, it's clear in the existing legislation. You don't want employers threatening employees. You don't want them threatening to, in terms of terminations or closing down the company, those types of things. And you cannot do that. But I think employers should have the right to communicate to their employees and say, okay, we understand that there's concerns, and then have a conversation and a dialogue. Those rules are fairly clearly set out. The shortness of the time frame, there's just logistical issues. If you have 5 days, if it doesn't happen over a weekend, and there's you get a call on Monday, you're having a vote on Friday. Yeah. I do think it comes down to fairness and giving employers an opportunity to respond in a meaningful way,
right? And
not just have this process rushed through in the hopes of, from a labor perspective, getting a favorable result at the end of the secret ballot.
Yeah. Minister Baines says, by the way, we're still processing this legislation. It was only tabled yesterday. We have experts looking into it, digging into it. So God only knows what other poison pills and surprises may be found in the body of it. But this is the high level stuff. Minister Baines says that fines for employers violating the labor code will be increased by 5 times. Why 5? Why not 6? Why not 4?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess I would say, if employers are going to violate the rules that are set out clearly in the code, then there's got to be some recourse.
Right.
What is the right level of a fine? It's difficult to say, okay, 5 times.
Yep. If there's any monkeying around by employers during the certification process, so in that 5 working days, the Labor Board will now have greater discretion just to come in and impose automatic union certification. Not even listening to what the folks actually want, the workers want.
Yeah, I think that's a little problematic. I mean, that's a very heavy hand to apply. Mm-hmm. So it is open to abuse. It's open to aggressive union organizers saying, oh, by the way, the company did this, did that, making a number of claims that may or may not be true. Yeah. And if they're not true, and the employer can't refute it in some reasonable way, then the company's automatically, or that worksite is automatically unionized. So it's a heavy stick. It should be used sparingly, mm-hmm. and only in extreme cases.
Yeah, there'll be code reviews at least every 5 years. Right now, there's no set time for code reviews. And then the construction carve out, and this is one we should spend a little time on. So construction is going to be treated differently from every other employment sector in the province, and it's being treated differently for really only one reason, because the BC Building Trades Unions gave $2.5 million to the BC NDP over the years, and this is their payback. Under this construction carve-out, union raids will now be allowed in July and August every single year of a collective agreement, rather than longer intervals, often 3 or 4 years, for other sectors. What this means is, this is not so much a big deal for non-unionized companies, but if you're unionized, say, by CLAC, who the Building Trades Union is absolutely loath, if you ever want to know what, if you ever want to see how the union brothers and sisters treat their CLAC brothers and sisters, just go onto a CLAC posting and see what the building trades, the nasty words they call them, rats and turkeys and all sorts of other things. Very professional of Tom Sigerson, the Building Trades Unions, by the way, to treat them like that. CLAC or CEW, Canada West Construction Union, or other non-blessed building trades, non-traditional building trades unions, they will now be open every single summer to having their contracts rated. And essentially what can happen is The traditional unions can go in there and try to organize their workers and pull them out of that contract and take them across. Big problems, number one, July and August, big construction season. So you're going to be fighting, if they're successful, you'd be fighting an election campaign essentially every summer during your busy time. Number two, every year, like if you sign a collective agreement and then 3 months later it's open to rating, you have no idea really how, if you're happy with that agreement or not. You haven't had time to actually see it like coalesce and take off. And number three, if at first they don't succeed, they'll try again. They can try this every single year. And let's say they only get 20% of a workforce to sign the cards in year one, they kind of have a base then to go on and year two and year three and year four and year five. There's just no security for the industry.
Yeah, and there's no balance. It's very disruptive. You can imagine you're working at a company at a particular site, and every year you get as you go into July and August, a whole bunch of union organizers running around trying to convince you to sign cards and switch from one union to another union. It's not that those workers are not unionized. They are. They're just not unionized under the union that is trying to raid those employees in that work site. It's very disruptive on the company and the employees. There should be a reasonable set of guidelines to say, well, you can't doing this every year. It's hard to imagine a union actually doing this, but they could. They now have the legal means to do this.
Well, they're not competitive in winning bids, and they're not working as much as they used to, so they've got nothing but time on their hands to try to poach.
So here's the challenge. Really, if you stand back and look at what the NDP is doing through labor legislation, so changes to labor code, employment standards, WorkSafe BC, is basically, if you think of the building trades, they represent only approximately 15% of the construction workers in this province. So only 15% of the 250,000 men and women who got up today and went to work on a construction site. And so their model is failed. It is a failing model. There's very little flexibility, very little choice for workers. And as a result, workers have voted accordingly to not choose to be organized by the building trades. And so I'm sure that's put a lot of pressure on the building trades. Now that they have a government in power that they've been through the NDP, a political party they've supported for decades, they're now able to get more favorable legislation. And from their view, they're hoping to see that 15% of construction workers represented by building trades go up to 20%, 25%. The balance, the moderation, the practical application of some of these pieces of legislation is going out the window under this government.
Absolutely. So those labor code changes came Tuesday. The day before, on Monday, Harry Baines was again in the press gallery making a series of changes to the Employment Standards Act. I'm going to run through those as well, or some of them at least. First of all, probably the most it's the one that got like no coverage, and yet it is by far the most profound of all of them. It's a requirement to, quote, meet or exceed the Act's requirements in collective agreements. What that means is if a union's negotiated something that doesn't fit with the Employment Standards Act, it's automatically bumped up to the standard of the Employment Standards Act. And where that is concerning for construction is for companies that are structured with differently, perhaps on scheduling or in overtime or in shortened work weeks. All of that now will be have to be reopened.
Yeah, and so it's really a backdoor way where if the building trades, in this case the building trades when we talk about construction, if they haven't been able to successfully negotiate clauses in the collective agreement, they can go to government and have government increase the standards through the Employment Standards Act to do through legislation what they couldn't do at the bargaining table. It's not a great precedent to be setting, and it's really not fair to the negotiators who are negotiating, and in often cases, very complex agreements. And there's a give and take when you negotiate, and so that is going to be under threat because the government go into the House and change employment standards, thereby forcing changes to collective agreement.
Hilariously, this will actually affect the BC government most of all. So. Collective bargaining, the so-called community benefit agreements, we call them project labor agreements on things like the Patello Bridge and the Broadway. They released a big 300-page deal they signed with their 19 favored building trades unions, the union monopoly only to build those projects. But as you recall, we did the research into some of the wage classifications, and we found more than a dozen different roles and jobs of people in there that will be paid less than minimum wage. even though it's been negotiated that way by the unions. Problem now is Employment Standards Act is going to raise all those folks up to the minimum wage, which means some of them will actually be paid, the same as people who, have had more experience according to the wage charts that were done. Yeah. This is going to end up meaning CBAs are going to cost even more money. So forget the minister's, frankly, lie that it's only going to cost 7% more. You would call it bald-faced spin, but I would go further. Yeah. This is another cost driver on these CBA union monopolies.
Yeah, and listen, when you're at the negotiating table for a specific project like a Site C or the construction of an LNG pipeline, for example, you often make accommodations to ensure that the workforce is applied in the rules and regulations around how work will be performed is going to be done in the most efficient and effective way. Given that working in a remote location on a pipeline is very different from working on a high-rise tower in downtown Vancouver. So both workers and employers are often incentivized to say, hey, if we do things this way, it will be much better for everyone, for the project, for workers, for companies, than if we did it this way. And the building trades are generally less flexible when it comes to making those types of accommodations. And obviously, the more that you hamstring negotiators through requirements that are legislated, the more difficult it will be to come to agreements that are going to make sense and not end up costing taxpayers and owners and end users more than it should.
There's new restrictions on employing children under the age of 16, and there's also firmer rules around the type of work that 16 to 18-year-olds can do. Mm-hmm. The concerning thing here isn't kids doing construction work. That almost never happens, and you can see in the WorkSafe BC claims that there's like a few $100s worth of fines over the years. Not much since 2010 on that for construction. But Minister Bains did cite construction specifically as an industry that should not have younger workers, i.e. under 18. So if you're if you're a high school grad with a late birthday, and you're 17 when you graduate, that first summer you may not be able to work construction because Minister Bains might think it's just a little too tough for you.
Yeah. Well, listen,
there should be safety training. We're not arguing that kids should be protected, but there's a lot of gray area in this.
Yeah, and I think a lot of construction companies have 20 employees or less in this province. Small business owners often. Who are when their kids are off in the summer, they're often helping out in some way in the workplace. So there's that balance between ensuring that if they're on a work site, and it could be in a restaurant, it could be on a construction site, they're safe, they're not in harm's way, and they're doing tasks that they're able to complete. Generally, it's fairly simple and small tasks. So, listen, there's a balance to be struck, and they've updated some parts of the code which need to be updated. And I don't think too many people can have too many problems with some of the changes they've made.
No. A couple other things. Employees can now go in disputes. Employees can now request up to 2 years back pay for unpaid wages and whatnot, rather than 6 months previously allowed. The right to an oral hearing when you've been accused of something has been taken away. That's not great. But here's a big one. The Employment Standards Board will be ordered to investigate every complaint and be more proactive. And I had a small business owner write me and say, we're going back to the 90s where, small businesses would have, these really thuggish Employment Standards Board people banging on doors investigating based on a spurious claim by a disgruntled former employee. Whether or not it was valid or not didn't matter. They were in these small business owners' faces. Yeah. The benefit of the doubt for employers is being taken away here.
Yeah, and listen, there has to be balance and practicality in all of this legislation. The challenge we have, the starting point for the New Democratic Party and this government is that no employer is a good employer, and we've heard that from so many people in and around this government. A distrust of business, small business, a distrust of entrepreneurs, and so that lays the foundation for some of the applications that we're concerned about. When you start basically taking a compliance and enforcement approach, and everyone's going to be audited, inspected in ways that don't make sense and won't actually improve outcomes. So that's going to be a concern to see how some of this starts to play out.
Yeah, and what would you say about the cumulative effect of what we've seen the past 2 days on business?
Well, I think if you add in, if you just sort of say in the last 2 years, and you start looking at all the regulatory changes, and this would be in that category, the tax changes. So $6 billion in taxes, increase in corporate tax, increase in personal income tax, making it more challenging to get projects approved. Canada is now 34 out of the 35 OECD countries in getting a construction permit approved. We see that when you're building projects around the Lower Mainland, where it'll often take as long or longer to get a project approved than it does to build it. And then you layer on changes to labor code, employment standards, WorkSafe BC, which are coming. And it's really an environment that's saying, you know what, if you want to do business and start a company, grow a company, expand in this province, it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so under this government.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like in Survivor, the classic challenge where they keep putting heavy bags on, adding heavy bags to their strongest guy, and the guy has to keep plowing through, and another bag, another bag, another bag, another bag. Death by 1,000 cuts. That is what we are living in the NDP world. Okay, speaking of death by 1,000 cuts, here's bad news for construction. Conference Board of Canada is out with their spring financial updates as to how all the different provinces and areas are doing. Turns out they are now predicting short-term and long-term major drops in housing starts in Vancouver and Victoria. And indeed, the first set of stats that they've released for spring 2019 prove that out. Vancouver last year, during a certain period, started 32,396 homes. That was in the Vancouver census area. Mm-hmm. This year, they're looking at more like 22,000, a drop of 10,000. And as many as, or as few as 21,000 next year. Same thing in Victoria, seeing a drop. Housing starts, often the canary in the coal mine for the BC economy. We've been saying for a long time, winter is coming.
Yeah, and listen, the government policy is working. They set out to effectively not look at affordability in the housing sector from a perspective of increasing supply, which is what they should have done. They felt, the view they took was we're going to through taxes and other regulations, we're going to suppress demand, and that will lower prices. Well, here's what's happening. We're getting less housing starts, which means less supply, and with people still moving to the Lower Mainland and other markets that are experiencing affordability challenges, the upward pressure on housing prices will not only remain, but will increase, because if there's less supply and demand doesn't change, you're going to have an upward pressure on prices. So
yeah, but Chris, I read in the media that, hey, now there's like 12 university students living in mansions on the west side, renting rooms, so everything's hunky-dory in housing.
Yeah, well, every single policy that they've done has really been aimed at, taxing the 1%, taxing the rich, making them pay more, but none of that's dealing with the affordability issue. No. And the way you deal with affordability is you put more supply on the market.
Like Seattle did.
Yeah, but if you think that...
Like Houston did.
If you think that if we increase supply, the construction companies, the builders, the developers will make more money, and that somehow that's bad.
Yeah.
And that's really the way they think. Their thinking is backward on this issue. They should be focusing on increasing supply and not on restricting it. So what do we have? The City of Vancouver comes out and says, nothing's going to be built on the Broadway corridor as SkyTrain's being planned until we sort of sit back and get the plan right, and everything's probably going to be rental. Yeah. That all sounds nice. And they said, we're not going to make the same mistake as we've made on Cambie. And if you look on Cambie, what was the mistake? You've got a whole bunch of new, you've got more density, you've got 4, 5, 6-story condos, and brand new. People are moving in. What is the mistake?
Oak Ridge is being redeveloped, isn't it?
So the mistake in their mind was that you had all these developers build more units, and somehow that's bad. No, that's exactly what you need. You need more of that.
Yeah. And if the more units are being built, the more these developers have to compete against each other on price points, the further the prices drop.
That's right. So when you get housing starts coming off, it means that prices are not going to come down.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing is on the real estate sales side, sales have come way off, but prices haven't come off that much. At the very high end, your $15 million home on the west side is now worth it would now sell for 12 million, 11 million, whatever that
Yeah.
number is. Who cares? Like that is not an affordability issue.
Yeah.
But your entry-level home, your entry-level condo, your mid-size home and condo, those prices have not moved off very much, maybe 5%. So their plan is working, but not in the way they thought it was, but in the way that every observer said it would.
Yeah.
Doing nothing for supply and doing nothing for prices. So they're not really addressing affordability.
No, they're not at all. Okay. Yesterday, Premier Kenney sworn in Alberta. Took a few BC faces with him. Katie Merrifield's working in his office. Athana Manouopoulos. How you say that last name?
I don't know.
Okay.
But she's a deputy
Athana,
minister.
she's the deputy minister for finance, so some BC talent making its way there. And day one, they enacted the turn off the taps legislation. They have not turned off the taps, but
They have the ability to do so.
yeah, and apparently Kenney called Horgan last night, and I'm sure they had a fruitful and productive conversation. Not at all. Chris, we already live in a world where $1.75 gas prices are slowly becoming the norm here in the Lower Mainland.
Yeah.
If he even cuts gasoline supply by a couple points, you might be talking about $2 gas here.
Yeah, and listen, this is all, the NDP have put themselves in this position. They started a trade war effectively with Alberta. The province that we're closest to, we've got very strong economic ties, business ties, investment ties. And so John Horgan set about starting effectively a trade war with our closest neighbor provincially. Didn't make any sense. The former NDP premier, for a number of weeks last year, stopped wine sales in Alberta, sale of BC wine in Alberta.
Yeah.
And whose fault was that? It was John Horgan's fault.
Yeah.
Because John Horgan has basically said he is going to pick and choose what products go through the Port of Vancouver, which is a federally regulated port. He doesn't like energy from Alberta flowing through a pipeline into BC and having that asset exported to foreign markets. Yeah. So he's going to try and stop it.
Yeah. Stop, he says. I don't want your Alberta oil. And then when they say, great, we're not going to send you Alberta. No, stop. You must send us Alberta oil.
Yeah, it's there's hypocrisy in this that of the highest degree. But it's a government that really doesn't have, they're not grounded in, they're not taking a principled approach to any of these issues.
No, it's about power.
That's all it is.
The only reason he is opposing Trans Mountain is because Andrew Weaver forced him to in that supply agreement. It's the only reason that he's still sitting in the Premier's office. And, he's kind of boxed in. So the problem, though, is it's bad for Canada. Like it is, he's putting personal power ahead of what's best for Canada, and I find that really offensive.
Yeah, this is a Canadian, it's a federally approved project. It was subject to like years and years and years of review by every expert you can shake a stick at.
Yep.
And it's subject to, I think, 197 conditions, legal and environmental, that Kinder Morgan at the time when they owned the pipeline would have to comply with to build and operate the pipeline. No jurisdiction does that kind of review for energy projects anywhere in the world. That wasn't good enough for Horgan. First thing he does, I'm going to use every tool in the toolbox. He challenges the review in court and the role of the BC government, and he's basically saying, I want to stop a federally approved project from going ahead in this province. It's offensive. It's not Canadian, because basically what Horgan's saying is, I'm going to hold the rest of Canada hostage. If I don't like what you're sending to Vancouver going through the port, I'm going to block it. And it's going to hurt us. And the responsibility for this trade war with Alberta rests at the feet of John Horgan and his government. Plain and simple.
And, Jason Kenney's correct. Almost 2/3 of British Columbians support this pipeline.
Yeah.
This is a small minority group. This is the tail wagging the dog. All right, well, we'll watch and see what Jason Kenney does. Okay, I just want to finish up on a very crushingly sad note. Over the past year, ICBA has been very proud to be a sponsor of the 1040 Podcast, which is a great Canucks podcast. Co-hosted by two guys, Jeff Patterson and Jason Botsford. And just this morning, we learned that from Jason's family that unexpectedly Jason Botsford has passed away of apparent heart failure, 48 years old. One of the great Canuck writers, did some great radio personality, just a guy who, I only met him a few times, but I felt like I knew him because I've read his work, listened to him, a million times on the radio and a million podcasts. He was a one-of-a-kind character. We're really heartbroken about this, and our condolences to Jeff, his co-host on the podcast. And more importantly, and then Jeff would tell you this too, to Botch's wife and 3 children and his family. Really a gut punch this morning for Canuck Twitterland, people who read and follow sports in this community, people in the media, and us at ICBA, who are darn proud to sponsor that podcast. So we'll see. Our condolences to Jeff and to the family, and if there's anything we can do, please let us know. That's it for the ICBA cast. We will be back probably in 2 weeks. Chris and I are traveling next week. Rex Murphy is in town, and then going to Prince George and Victoria. But we will definitely be back within the next 10 to 14 days to talk more about BC politics, the effect on construction, and on small business. So until then, thanks for watching.
Have a good day.